back to the Wednesday Word. Today was one of those technology challenging days, technologically challenged days. Anyway, so I have a great interview with my good friend Albert, who was on about a month ago. And today we discussed the word bond or bonds. And it's quite interesting. Um, and I think you'll enjoy it. Because I'm having technical challenges today, we're going to keep this intro very short. So with that, enjoy.
Well, it's good to be here again, and thanks again for agreeing to join the show. And I love the insight that you have is invaluable. And I know that's one of the things that is important to me is collaborating with other people. And I've like you, Albert, we're in study groups together, and we have other study groups that we're not even in together, but that has become really valuable. And maybe it's just a school of hard knocks, but if you like knowledge, I think you find a way to get it. And whether it's just reading books on your own or eventually you got to branch out. So
I spend a lot of time in the school of hard knocks, so I will be very well educated and versed in that school. So we're talking about bonds today. What's up with that?
yeah, so of course we're here to talk about words, and it's always interesting the journey that we take with that. I often find more than I intended to, looking at all these different references and different types of dictionaries and all that good stuff. So yeah, bonds. I was doing some research and noticed that, of course, it is a lot what we think of, that it has a lot to do with having ties to things, right? Being bound to things. And we even have a bond market. There's a stock market and a bond market. And I think, who really wants to dive into that stuff? It's kind of seems like it can be boring, but what are we going to find? you
Right.
know so what did you find in your research?
Well, you've hung around me long enough. My dictionary, my is the Bible. That's kind of where I like to start with things. But sometimes we have to start with what we know and kind of work backwards through the process, right? So a lot of similar things. I start with, okay, well, when I think of the word bond, what does that mean today? And we think of bond markets, or maybe a bail bond would be a common thing to talk about. And then, so I go to my Bible and I just start I look up in the Bible the word bond, right? And it took me several different places. So where I want to start today, it happens to be in the New Testament. There's this story. It goes kind of, I'll just, it's like three, 4 verses here. I'll just read it to you. So it says, then they brought him being Jesus, Yeshua, a demon possessed man who was blind and mute, and Jesus healed him so that he could talk and see. And all the people were astonished, and they said, hey, this might be the son of David. And but when the Pharisees heard this, they said, it's only by Beelzebub, the prince of demons, that he drives these demons out. So Jesus, knowing their thoughts, he said to them, every kingdom divided against itself will be ruined, and every city or household divided against itself will not stand. If Satan drives out Satan, he is divided against himself. How then can his kingdom stand? And if I drive out demons by Beelzebub, by whom do your people drive them out? So then, they will be your judges. But if it is by the Spirit of God that I drive out demons, then the kingdom of God has come upon you. Okay, so he has this huge contrast he's building here, right? Okay,
Right.
and this gets down, verse 29 here, he says, or again, so how can anyone enter a strong man's house and carry off his possessions unless he first bind the strong man? Then he can plunder his house.
Wow.
So bind, depending upon the version of the Bible you're reading there, you might also see ties up. So you mentioned bonds have to do with tying things, right?
Yes.
Okay, so the point is that, this guy's going to rob someone's house. And so he breaks into the house and he ties up the owner of the house, and then he steals everything in the house. Okay, because what would happen if he didn't tie him up? He'd fight back, right?
Yeah, exactly. He
Okay.
defend his property and his person.
100%. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. His people. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
there you
So,
go.
so when he so when I after I read through this, I was like, okay, great story to understand binding here. It gives you an image, of the robber breaking into the house and stuff. So when I went into, I just used Blue Letter Bible this morning when I was looking this up, and it says to bind, tie, or fasten with chains, to throw into chains. And that's the literal meaning. Okay. But then in languages, just like our language, you can also get figurative or metaphorical meanings from things. So then it goes in and it says Satan is said to bind a woman bent together by means of a demon as his messenger, taking possession of the woman and preventing her from standing upright. So in some way, he has caused this woman to be bent over and ill, right? So she is bound by whatever happened. Okay. So then it goes on, it says to bind, to put under obligation of the law or a duty. So we see this today, like when we talk about bonds and the bond markets or municipal bonds. You might even see in Oregon, we have these measures that we put forward, and they will be called general obligation bonds.
Yes.
Okay. So here we have this word. So really they're saying general bonds because a bond is an obligation, right?
Yes.
But we understand today. So usually these are like, we want to build a new school or we want to fix our roads or something like that. And so what's happening is the government puts this measure out, or someone puts this measure out, and we all vote on it. And we go, yes, please give us an obligation to pay.
They're committed bonds.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yes.
And they're committing us, right?
Right. And then
Yeah.
we go along with it.
Correct. Okay.
Yes.
So it becomes an obligation on our life, right? Okay. Then it says to be bound to one, a wife or a husband.
Matrimonial bonds. I read that in Black's Law yesterday. Yes.
That's right. Okay. So I was at one of my karate students' weddings several years back, and they genealogically, historically, they're from England. That's their heritage, right? Particularly, maybe like specifically, I think Ireland or something like that. So there's this old Celtic tradition that they brought forth in their wedding ceremony, and they put their hands together and then they tied their hands together. So they're in bond with each. So it's this physical ritual to express that bond that they have.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. So, and again, for me, these word pictures are things that help me understand the meaning of what's behind something. That's
well. I want to interject really quick. I was thinking about, how does a bond relate to an oath? So, and I don't necessarily think that all bonds have to be bad or negative. So
many people would say marriage is a good thing.
Right. Exactly.
Some of us have been through that process. We might have a tainted view on that, but
right. Well, I think it's interesting how a lot of this stuff goes back to intent with, the intention behind the words and what we do, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that it still comes out here, the intention behind the words that we use and, oath versus bond. And, so anyway.
Well, if I said to you, my word is my bond, is that a positive thing or a negative thing?
It depends on what your word is, I guess.
Okay, fair enough. I'm too optimistic. I would just say, oh, I see that as a good thing, right? Because I want to do good in my life, right? But you're correct. But you're correct. It could be either way, right?
I generally think of that word as your bond because I've thought about that a lot, in thinking about the word bond and bonds. And I think that I have a positive association with that, your word being your bond. and so I agree with you. And I think that kind of goes back to, it's still back to the intention again, and the integrity, and, how do you usually speak, and anyhow.
But correct. And so the other side of the equation is, you have a mafia leader who hires a contract killer, and the killer says, "My word is my bond. I will kill this person." Right. Well,
Exactly.
either way, he's saying you can trust me on this, no matter what. I'm going to fulfill the contract. Right.
Yeah.
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 Okay. So
Honor among thieves too. Oh my.
yeah. So that was kind of the Greek background, New Testament. We mostly study that in Greek, although we have Hebrew manuscripts now. But down at the bottom of this, it listed letter C here. It says, by a Chaldean and rabbinical idiom, it's the equivalent of the word asar in Hebrew. So, which means to forbid, to prohibit, to declare to be illicit. Okay.
Wow. Illicit.
Yeah. So
Huh.
not legal, right?
Right.
So when I look in the King James, then in the Hebrew, I find this H631, and it says to bind. It's used 47 times to bind something. 4 times is the word prison. 4 times is the word for tying something up. 2 times as miscellaneous usages. No, I'm sorry. 2 times as prisoner, 15 times as a miscellaneous usage. So in other words, they're trying to come up with a word to make it make sense in English to fit better. Okay. Other than bind, prison, or tie. Okay. So you might also, for example, get like harness. So if you bind your horse to a cart, or you've harnessed it to that cart or something like that, you might get gird, to gird something up, to make an attack. You've bound yourself to the fight, type thing. An obligation of oath. So here's that word, swearing, making an oath, a vow, that type of thing, right?
Yes.
To be imprisoned, to be bound, to be taken prisoner. These are all from this root word asar. So I keep digging. And so then I go back into my lexicons and I look up this word asar. And there's this famous translator back in the 1800s. His name was Gesenius. And he says to bind, to make fast. That's a good old English word there. To bind to anything, binding, which are collected under the root azar. So originally the root was the word azar. It became asar over time. Okay, so then it goes into, it says to bind, to put in bonds. And again, they didn't have bond paper back then. So we're talking about fetters, handcuffs, right? To make captive or to hold in prison. So if you're in prison, you were bound probably to get there, and now you're stuck there and you can't get out, just like handcuffs, right?
Yep.
Okay, to bind or fasten animals to a vehicle, like a harness to a chariot. To bind on, to join in battle. We talked about that one. To bind a bond or prohibition upon oneself. So to bind oneself with a vow, like a vow of abstinence, promising to abstain from certain things, like when they took Nazirite vows, then they wouldn't drink wine, for example, for that time.
Right.
So you are bound to that vow. You're bound to that. Oh, whatever came out of your mouth, you're stuck now, right? So we see Yeshua, Jesus, in the New Testament, then he comes along and he goes, you have to let your yes be yes and your no be no. And there's no gray area in between, because you got to be really careful when you start swearing things, because we're going to hold you to it.
Yes.
So you better know what you're getting into.
So your word is your bond.
Correct.
My mind just goes back to the praying and spelling being 2 sides of the same coin, because could bite you. Pay attention to your words.
Well, and pay attention to the documents you sign, right? Because they are binding you. They're contracts. They're binding you to something, and you may not know exactly what you're getting bound into, right?
Yes.
Okay. So then I just looked up the legal definition of a bond today, right? And it said a bond refers to an obligation, okay, to pay a specified amount of money. In the field of business, a bond functions similar to a loan, and it is sold by entities seeking an inflow of cash now in exchange for the promise of future interest on that cash later. So I buy a bond, and then I get a Series EE bond from the government, and they tell me if I hold on to that for 20 years or whatever, I'm going to get that amount plus some extra back.
Yes.
Right? Okay.
Yep.
So it's definitely, there's a financial component that it may or may not have been there in the very original beginning of this, right?
Right.
So then I went to Black's Law Dictionary. Black's Law Dictionary defines bond generally as an obligation or a promise, and a bail bond as a bond given to the court by a criminal defendant's surety to guarantee that the defendant will duly appear in court in the future. So again, it's like we had future interest. If I buy a bond from the government, I get future interest, right? But now it brings up this word surety. So I'm going to go to the bail bondsman and buy a bond from him to give to the court clerk. And that is a promise that I'm going to show up to the court date.
Yep.
So they let me out of jail because I've provided this debt instrument to them.
Yep.
And if I don't pay that, what happens?
The bondsman's going to come get you.
He's going to get me because I'm putting up my body as surety, right? Yes. Okay. All right. So I was like, well, that's kind of really interesting. I see how this all works together. Underneath that, it said a signed promise to pay an amount to do something on a date. So that would be like a performance bond that a contractor might get to build a house or, something like that, right?
Yep.
So the big thing for us to understand, it seems to me, is that when we have a bond on us, it holds us captive. I have an obligation now, just like a loan is my obligation, right?
Right.
Okay. So now my personal example, right? This is all running around in my head, right? So I do a lot of humanitarian work in the third world. Okay. You know about some of these projects. Okay. So I like to joke that I'm a human trafficker. Okay. But I do it for Yeshua. I do it for Jesus, right? So what I do is I go into a third world country and I buy slaves, people that are actual slaves. Okay. Now they got into that role for multitudes of reasons, but a really common one is that they had some debt and they couldn't pay it. So they go to this guy who owns a giant brickyard and they go, hey, I'll work for you. You pay my debt off and I'll work for you and pay it off with some interest, right? And so the brickyard owner hires him. Now, what he doesn't know, because most of them are illiterate, is that the contract says I get you, I get your wife, and I get all your kids. So it's not the man that goes to work every day. Like we would send someone to the contractor and he would work at the work site, get a paycheck and go home. No. These guys, they go to the brickyard and they move their whole family into a little hovel. And
you have not told me that part of the story. My goodness.
Yeah. So I generally keep it kind of nice and calm and feel goody. So yeah, it's pretty serious. So even infants are out in the brickyards collecting dirt and sand and dust to make these bricks, right? And they go from 6 o'clock in the morning in 100-degree weather until 9 o'clock at night. That's all they do is make bricks. And they will never pay off what they owe, because the slave master keeps sticking things on top of it. Oh, you used a Kleenex. Oh, you used a bar of soap. Oh, you drank my water. And they just keep heaping it on. And so it's generational. They can
Wow.
never break out of this. Once you're in, you never get out.
Wow.
That is an obligation.
That's some really messed up stuff right there.
It's pretty messed up, right? So what do? I go in and I pay the bond that's on them, the contract, okay? And I buy that contract and I set them free. And at the end of that, and I give them a giant hunk of money. It's all, everything's in cash, right? So I got these big bundles of money, and we're counting out the money to the slave owner, and he's recounting the money. And then in his book, he puts a line through the person's name. So that contract has been canceled, and he writes paid on his accounting sheet. And then the best part, I get the bond back. I get the receipt that is now canceled. Okay. So they have that the rest of their lives. If he came back and he said, "Oh, you owe me money," or something like that, he can hold up the bond, the contract, the obligation, and say, "No, no, no, no. Your signature is right here, and this was paid off." And I've got multiple copies. Okay.
Wow.
Yeah. So what I'm doing is I'm paying off his bond, his contract that put an obligation on him and his family and held him in bondage or slavery, right?
Yeah.
So when we think of so again, that's not our life here. We're in the first world, living in America. Life's great, that stuff is, it's all up in other crazy
We're
places.
not going to get too far into it, but I wanted to say, or is it?
Well, so if you realize that a bond means lack of freedom, then we as a country are completely in bondage today to the fact that we have lost our substantive rights and freedoms in America.
Right. Yes.
But we just agree to it. But that's what the guy in Pakistan did. He agreed to it. But he didn't know what was going to happen.
He didn't know all the terms of the contract.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
So when you realize that the government, our government today, in the last 100 years or more, has taken bonds out on us.
Yes.
Right? That means we have obligations on us that we were never told about.
But exactly, and that's key right there. Things we were never told about, because that's part of equity, which would be jumping to the New Testament, right? Mm-hmm. Remember, watch grace, guys. Watch the grace word. Then if they didn't tell us, if there wasn't a full meeting of the minds when it comes down to equity and maxims of equity in that law jurisdiction, and that is biblical. Mm-hmm. It's also still a thing, not just biblical, that we then have been bonded under fraud, and fraud vitiates everything.
Yes.
There was no meeting of the minds. In fact, it seems that there may have been collusion to hide the terms of the contract because it wasn't in plain language. Yeah. And on and on and on and on, right?
So when I was kind of studying this morning, and like most of my studies, I have lots of, I call them rabbi trails that I go down, in Hebrew and all these different things. And so when I was looking at the bond market today, right, I could only find 2021 figures here. But so, my mom, when she passed, she had a brokerage account and it had a bunch of stocks in it. Right. Okay. And so when she passed, I got her brokerage account. Thanks, Mom. Right. That was wonderful. So, I had to all of a sudden start learning about stocks and things like this and how this works. And what in the world did she give me here? It's a blessing, but I don't know anything about it. Right. So the New York Stock Exchange, the NASDAQ, are this giant financial market. Right. it's worth $50 trillion. Okay.
Yeah.
A lot of money. Okay. The bond market in 2021 is 3 times bigger than the stock market is. So it was
Oh,
worth 127.
we've heard story that it's can be, I want to say it's up to even like 100 or 1,000 times bigger, because there's a lot of it, internationally that we
Yeah,
just don't.
these were only US figures. Yes. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Yes.
So, yeah, and so there are other stock exchanges globally. There are other bond exchanges globally. Yes, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
But so to realize that, so all bonds are debt, right? So they're obligations they're owed. So the obligations that we owe are 3 times bigger than the stock market.
Yeah, that sounds like a pretty hefty debt slavery package to me.
It does to me too. Yeah. Yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's
We didn't know about it. This goes back to what I'm not going to belabor the topic, but I still feel like there's a frequency that ties in, spiritually, when those bonds are out there, even if we didn't know it. And as we become more aware of these things, then we consciously sever ourselves from those bonds on the level when we realize, wait a minute, I didn't sign up for that. I didn't agree to that. I feel like there's still an undertone of an energetic thing that happens with all of those bonds as well. And this may sound cuckoo, but it kind of goes back to we see in the science with like Masaru Emoto, and it's cymatics. There's another, I can never think of his name when I want to, another scientist even brought it out with, I think, cymatics even before Masaru Emoto's amazing work, where they actually show how the frequency of words comes out and how it impacts the physical.
Mhm.
And so all of those bonds are in writing with words. And so it's sort of like spell casting on people, other people, even when you're, say, writing bonds on other people that don't know you're writing bonds on them, which would be the majority of the population. I mean, we've learned about that. So anyway, that's enough. That was kind of a big.
So let me go take that tangent, make a little left-hand turn here, right?
Please do.
So there was a set of videos that I watched. I think it was on Netflix. I don't know if it's still there or not. By this woman. Her name will come to me in a second, I think. But it was all about cleaning and organizing your house. And there were like, I don't know, let's say 10 episodes or something like that, right? And she goes in and she teaches people how to clean their houses and organize them and stuff like that, right? And each family is completely different. They're whole different scenarios, right? Older people, younger people, gay people, just everything, right? Single people. And in every case, what happened is they cleaned their houses and learned to organize their homes, and their relationships all got better.
Wow.
And I go, well, wait a second. I mean, it's like so noticeable as you're watching, episode after episode, and you're like, wow, like their marriage is better because how does a dirty house, okay, a frequency of a dirty house affect a relationship? Well, every time you walk in, you feel like crap, right? And that affects your emotional level, right? And then, well, get this out of here and get your stuff out of here. And so there's all these little things that the physical environment is causing this emotional stress in us, right?
Yeah.
And again, if you want to talk about vibration and frequency or emotion, however you want to coach it in those terms, right? But again, like I'm not necessarily a slovenly kind of personality. I like things organized, right? But I never realized how that was connecting emotionally and relationally to other people.
Right.
Right. So I kind of see that as the same thing, what you're describing, that there's this physical manifestation going on with these bonds. And that, so again, like, let's say you have a mortgage on a house, right? That's an obligation. Okay. Debt obligation.
It's a death grip, a
Yeah.
mortgage.
Mortgage. Yeah. Get death. Right.
Yeah,
So, so every month you have to worry then about whether or not you're going to be able to pay your mortgage. But that worry affects the relationship between the two of you, right?
yes,
And all of a sudden now I've lost my job, and how are we going to pay the bills? And, right? And so then all of that relational stuff, we may not put it front and center, but it's all because of this debt over here,
that's right.
right?
Yeah,
So as a country, if we were debt free as a country, I think it would feel different because people would have time to do other things and be focused on their higher mind instead of their lower mind and just trying to survive, week to week, paycheck to paycheck and stuff like that.
yes, exactly. I agree. Yeah, I think it is the same thing. And we're learning a lot more about frequency now, or we're talking about the things that we have learned scientifically about frequency more now. And there's definitely a much bigger conversation at hand and comprehension about how much it really does impact things. So, and that's why the Wednesday word, it was such a cool, wow, we were spewing frequency. Not only do we have an energy field, but, like a dog when it barks can't be as specific with its communication as we can.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe other dogs can understand that dog barking, but we can't. And there's a lot more of us in these populated areas. And so when we bark our words, it does have an impact. It's just like rocks in a pond. And we
Mm-hmm.
do have our own, energetic field, but we also, I think, make a bigger boom when we speak, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And those words have an impact in the physical. We've seen it. It's scientifically proven now. So
Absolutely.
yeah, we need to remember the importance of our words. And like I said, I think back to with the bonds. I don't think that like an oath doesn't have to be a bad thing, and it's another kind of a bond. So I don't think that all bonds have to be bad.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are some good bonds out there. Um, so it just depends. I know a good friend of mine that I talk about a lot, has a really neat perspective, but he's studied so many things in great detail. And one of them that really got to him about knowing about the bond market and being around some people that were really rich, and knowing more about bonds and the history of bonds, all of the language with the bonds, including insurance, car insurance, house insurance, those are also other forms of bonds. And so, but all the terminology goes back to the shipping of slaves around the world. Um, and oftentimes I don't want to get into a big discussion about that, but it, all the language around bonds goes back to the insurance. People that would ship slaves used to use actuarial tables and things like that to get insurance because they knew that some of their cargo was going to die and not be viable anymore. And it's just awful. It's this horrible, horrible thing. But it's really difficult for my friend, and he's right, I think, that you can have a really negative association with the word bonds when you know something like that. So, but I think it's also, having a broad enough perspective that I don't think all bonds have to be bad, and that's where we've had bad things infiltrate good things, and we see that everywhere. And how do we, alchemize, neutralize the energy in the world that we're living in to have more positive than negative? Do we really just want it to be about making money at other people's expense, like the people that you free, whole families that you free out of this bondage when you do your work? And, so yeah, I mean, I think we just need to be cognizant, about that.
I do think you had mentioned earlier, it is so important for us to um, just mind our words. Things come out of our mouths. We sign, we are so used to just putting our signature on everything. We autograph anything put in front of us at a store, or online. We connect to an app and it says, "Here's the terms of agreement." We click it, and we have no idea what we just obligated ourselves to. You know,
That's right. Yeah.
um, just being cognizant of these things is a good first step. And then I think applying some discipline, self-control to your spending habits is probably a good idea, so that you're not taking on, all of this. Last couple years ago, I had this double hip surgery, and I am part of a group part of a ministry that we share each other's medical bills with each other's and stuff like that. And they covered most of it. It was $98,000 to get, two new hips installed. But there was like another 8,000 of that I ended up having to cover. And I didn't have $8,000. So now I'm in debt. And, I'm doing everything I can to get rid of that bill, because I hate that feeling of that obligation being there. In fact, it was really interesting. I haven't really connected this to bonds so much, but so the number one word in the Bible connected to sin is debt.
I was going to say the next word we have to cover should be debt, maybe.
Yeah, I think it'd be good. So if so the feeling that a person has when you are in debt, okay, oh, I got to pay that bill. Oh, it's a burden on me, right? I'm worried about whether I can keep my my word and pay the obligation on time and things like that. That's the same feeling as when one sins.
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
the emotional connection is the same. So in the Lord's Prayer, it talks about forgive us our sins as we forgive others. But that's in one gospel. In the other gospel, it's the same prayer, but it says debts.
Yes.
Right. So debt equals sin, because emotionally it's the same. And that's a lot the same thing what you're talking about with frequency, vibration, all of this. It feels terrible. So what do we do to get rid of that feeling? Don't live that way anymore. Choose another lifestyle, right?
Choose a higher frequency.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, again, that we have this higher brain and lower brain, and the lower brain is where all of our fears are at. And the higher brain is the one that sets us free. It reasons and it thinks about and it hopes and stuff like that. And so when we have all of that negative emotion, those negative frequencies going on in us, we're actually operating out of that lower brain. And that's the least healthy place in the world to be operating from, is from fear. So
Yes. It's interesting. Some of the other newer friends in the last year that I've made that really get into the words also talk about the brain in your gut, there's that too. And there's a whole lot of interesting correlations. I have a lot more to learn before I can talk about that. But some of these people now in my study groups, I'm just like blown away. There are things that correlate with like the gastric brain,
Mhm.
that are actually, you can see in a lot of these false gods and different things like that. It's really wild. It's like blows your mind. So, I mean, I don't get it all yet, but it's pretty wild. So that's interesting that you're talking about the lower brain,
Mhm.
you know.
So apparently there's also a really lower brain.
Yes.
Stomach, right? Yeah. Well, again, this is one of the first things when I went down my journey from coming out of the church, the institutional church. I changed to a biblically clean diet, right? So God was concerned about our gastrointestinal tract. kind of an interesting thought. I had never connected it to the research we've done on brain and gut now. But that'd be a fascinating study.
You will have to talk to some of my newer friends. Yeah, that would be really interesting. I know John would love to talk with you more. And yeah, we got to get some of our other people mixed up some more on some of these calls. A lot of the time, I end up on, even outside of the study groups, on calls with some of these newer friends that, and you know, it's all kind of just off the cuff that these amazing conversations happen. And I don't know when it's going to happen, you know? But
Just life happens.
yeah, life happens.
Fun.
You know, you got to roll with the punches or roll with the tide, something like that.
Yeah.
I was like the river analogy.
Surfing for Jesus. Yeah. Mhm. No.
Surfing for Jesus.
That's right. Awesome. Well, this has been a great chat.
It has. Thank you so much. And I don't know, you up for another one? You want to do dead, or we can
No,
think
I got to get to Chicago and then back. But yeah, in August sometime we could do another one.
All right, cool. Well, good luck with your studies. I know you have your event coming up, and I look forward to hearing about it.
Awesome. Take care.
Take care. Bye.